Welcome back to DataBytez, your source for data-driven principles. Today we are covering a subject that everyone loves, wealth, and really uncovering the greatest limiting factor into achieving wealth. See, everyone wants to get rich, but not everyone really knows how to get rich. It seems to be this elusive goal that we can never really grasp or put our hands around. But it's actually fairly clear-cut exactly what we need to do. But we have to take a little bit of a history lesson, as well as looking at some other parts that we've covered before in different aspects. And again, things kind of bleed over. That's just kind of the nature of principles. When you start really getting into the nitty gritty, you can't really avoid the fact that they're just kind of pervasive. They kind of bleed into multiple different spheres. So starting with wealth creation is more behavioral than mathematic. So this comes from the psychology of money, which we're going to be referencing quite a bit here because it's pretty pertinent to our discussion of wealth creation. And this was written by Morgan Housel. I think that's how you say his name. Anyways, money has little to do with how smart you are and a lot to do with how you behave. And behavior is hard to teach, even to really smart people. A genius who loses control of their emotions can be a financial disaster. The opposite is also true. Ordinary folks with no financial education can be wealthy if they have a handful of behavioral skills that have nothing to do with formal measures of intelligence. So, off the bat, we're establishing a tone here about how wealth is about behavior. And behavior has really nothing to do with intelligence. You might know, personally, someone who is book smart but lacks a lot of common sense. And someone with common sense who is able to do better in life overall because of it not translating into the book smart's not translating into the appropriate action. And so this is especially true with money, with wealth creation. It really just takes a systematic approach, but the problem is we rely on our ability to consciously follow through. And as we go deeper, we're going to realize that this follow through is inherently flawed because it's not something we can sustain most often. Some people are like superheroes that just have an endless source of self-control and willpower, but most of us are not. I know I'm not like that, and it takes me controlling my environment. It takes me controlling and removing choice, and that we're going to see that as we go along. But a little bit going into the history and understanding that money itself is a relatively new concept. So up on this here on the screen, you're going to see what's called the Lydian starter. This is the world's first state-produced currency, minted in the 17th century BC in modern-day Turkey, approximately 2,500 years ago. Now, if you have seen my other video, the 5 posits, our brains took millions of years to produce, something on the order of 6 million years. And this again came as a result of us navigating through the wilderness, through nature, as survival of the fittest, things trying to kill us, and we needed to shape our minds, our ability to deal with our surroundings in a certain way. And so we are very reactionary by nature, and you would be hard pressed to see a true change in our psychology after only 2,500 years, which is a drop in the bucket over 6 million years of development. And even more so, because our monetary system, our financial system has continued to grow and evolve, not much faster, at a much faster rate than our brains have. And so it's very difficult to separate the behavior from the brain, from ourselves, from the animal. And so things don't always operate rationally, even though with money they kind of need to. Again, going back to referencing the psychology of money, because I got this part here. Retirement is an even newer concept. So we looked at the Lydian starter, which came about 2,500 years ago. But the concept of retirement is around 60. No, we need 40 years old. I'm doing my math wrong here at the time of this recording. So, again, to reference Morgan Housel, It was not until the 1980s that the idea that everyone deserves and should have a dignified retirement took hold. The 401k, the backbone savings vehicle of American retirement, did not exist until 1978. The Roth IRA was not born until 1998. The Roth IRA being a concept even younger than me. And so it doesn't make sense in the system that we establish for us to really win, because most of us have a hard time conquering ourselves. It's a lifelong process, and we have not developed alongside money. It's not something that we evolved with naturally. It's something man-made. It's a social construct, and so it has its place in order for us to navigate and create society as we have it, but it's not natural. I guess that's the best way to put it. It's not a natural thing, so we have to kind of go about it in a way that you wouldn't naturally do, that depends on yourself. And some of us, or you might have been of the mindset that, oh, I can just change my behavior. I just need to consciously choose. Again, the conscious choice of saying, I need to do this, I need to do that. And I don't know how many times I've seen it where, not just in financial planning, but in life in general, people have a plan that they want to do, and then they fail to follow through with it. I think the most common one that's memed to death, right, is trying to lose weight at a New Year's resolution, saying, I'm going to get in shape, and then by the time, June comes around, you're like, oh man, I haven't really kept to my New Year's resolution to lose this weight. And that is because of something that is fairly known. And before I transition over, I want to mention something else, and that it's also important before moving on, is that retirement is a new concept. These new ideas, more so than the fact that these ideas are constantly changing, the ideas of what we get about money come from our surroundings. Often what we learn about money is from our parents. And so there's this correlation beyond if you were just to look at the idea that they have access to resources, but rich kids raise rich parents, and poor kids raise poor parents raise poor kids. And this is because beyond, again, just the fact that rich parents have access to more resources, are able to probably put their kids in better positions, it's also the habits that are usually imparted from the rich parents to the kids, and how money is conceptualized, and how the habits that are formed are very important in this transfer process as you grow up. So, for instance, if you look at it logically, it doesn't make sense for a poor person, someone in financial straits, to buy lottery tickets. But that is the group that ends up buying lottery tickets most often, because again, the behavior, the trait is, oh, hopefully, you can make it big by just buying this ticket over and over again. But that's not usually how it works. You're more likely to be struck by lightning. And so these lessons, these behavioral traits, once they're kind of set in stone, they're really hard to change. So if you're lucky to be born into a household that was really good with money, understanding how to properly navigate the monetary system as we have it, the economy as we know it, then you were just luck of the draw. But for a lot of us, who come from working class households, this is not immediately apparent. And so again, behavior is hard to change. How do we do that? We cannot just brute force it, because as discussed by Josh Kaufman of the Personal MBA, willpower is finite. Willpower is a finite resource and will fail. So to quote him exactly, willpower can be thought of as an instinctual override. It's a way to interrupt our automatic processing in order to do something else. Whenever we experience a situation in which it's useful to inhibit our natural inclinations, willpower is required to keep us from responding. As such, willpower is a useful tool, but it has certain inherent limitations. Our reserves of willpower are very limited and become depleted with use. And again, You might think, oh, that's just a mental strength thing. But no, he continues further. Willpower has a physiological component. So Dr. Roy Baumeister, a researcher at Florida State University, found that our ability to successfully use willpower for self-control tasks is dependent on physiological fuel, blood glucose. Acts of willpower deplete relatively large amounts of glucose, and when those stores run low, we have a hard time using willpower to inhibit behavior. That's why it's difficult to resist dishing up a bowl of ice cream at 8:30 p.m. when you're on a diet. By then, your stores of willpower are gone. Again, it comes to our inability to just overcome our natural instincts, our natural predilections. And a lot of this comes from what we were taught and imparted by our parents, by the setting in which we grew up. Again, if you grew up, back in the 1940s, that's when you were born and brought up, the concept of retirement was something relatively unheard of. It's really, there's going back to the psychology of money, there's this idea that Morgan Housel discusses, in which there's this misconception that everyone in the past had access to a pension, when it's in fact, I believe 15% of people who worked in that era, before all that, actually had access to pensions. It was more common for people to work until they died, work until they couldn't anymore. I see it because my own mother, at the age of, and she's now, I believe, near 75, she refuses to stop working. It's just, and she tells me, it's like the one thing I inherited from my parents was this nonstop commitment to work. Because again, there was no idea that you would be able to retire with dignity. It's just you worked until you couldn't, or you couldn't live. And so sometimes it takes a bit of stepping out of what you believe you're entitled to, what you believe that should be, into looking at what the larger overall history of what things are. Now, it's always good to push things forward, but to not let it disillusion you from what the larger reality it's been for people. So, transitioning forward, we know that willpower is finite. It has a physiological components and limitations, and we know that wealth creation is more behavioral than intellectual. It's not something that you can just think your way to. It requires conscious choice, but our ability to make those choices consistently is not infinite. So where does that leave us? What do we do? And the best answer I found was from a book called I Will Teach You to Be Rich by Ramit Sethi. And in the answer lies in automation. We need to remove the human element. And here's his exact quote. The key to taking action is quite simply making your decisions automatic. And this should be something that you carry over into a lot of your professional life if possible. It's really the best thing to do. Eliminating the human element, eliminating choice. Trying to create systems that make the decisions for you so you do not have to really do anything yourself. It's probably the most lucrative thing you will ever do, is if the more things you can remove yourself from. Now, you should take a lot of thought into thinking what the system will do, what that process will look like. But once you make that up from an investment, it's really just leave it alone. So if you say, I only have this much to spend, try to set it in a way that if you try to spend more than that, you just can't. And that's kind of the issue with the way the modern system is set up, is that it thrives on debt. In fact, fun fact is that there exists more debt in the world than actual money. It's impossible for people to actually pay off everything. The world cannot exist without debt. The financial system would completely collapse. So it really doesn't want you to be debt-free, and you should be, at least on personal debt. Business debt is a kind of a separate topic, and I believe business debt is great. If you're able to make it separate from you, not able to touch you on a personal level. Absolutely fantastic. When leveraged correctly, it allows you to grow really fast, but on a personal level, debt is not great. It makes you a slave and it eliminates choices. And so if we're able to make automation happen, if we're able to automate our financial decisions, our financial choices, the reality is most commonly preached personal financial strategies work. The problem is we self-sabotage it. So if we don't self-sabotage by making incongruent choices with what the plan entails, we're going to win. And you might be thinking, well, that's silly. What do you mean most plans work? Well, a story that really changed my perspective was that of Ronald Read, the $1 million janitor. Now, I believe he died, yes, in 2014. And when he died, he had a final, I believe, what do they call that? Net worth of $8 million. And he ended up donating 6 and passing down 2 million. And again, it's like, this is a janitor. So let's kind of examine his story. So Ronald Read was an American philanthropist, investor, janitor, and gas station attendant. He was born in rural Vermont. He was the first person in his family to graduate high school, having to hitchhike to campus each day. For those who knew Ronald Read, there wasn't really much else worth mentioning. His life was about as low-key as they come. Read fixed cars at a gas station for 25 years and swept floors at JCPenney for 17. He bought a 2-bedroom house for $12,000 at the age of 38 and lived there the rest of his life. He was widowed at age 50 and never remarried. A friend recalled that his main hobby was chopping firewood. Read died in 2014, age 92, which is when the humble rural janitor made international headlines with $8 million in assets at the time of his passing. And so he went from janitor to philanthropist. Now, of course, in the modern day context, we'd be looking at that $12,000 property and focusing in on that. But here's something that I think is more important. More important than, yes, the cost of living being extremely high, which is true. I don't want to take away from the reality that cost of living is exceedingly high. But that he didn't have some fancy financial investment strategy. All he did was put his money into blue chip stocks. Now, if you're not familiar with the term, blue chip just means things like buying Microsoft, Apple, Nvidia, only those kinds of the massive companies. Those are blue chip stocks. And so that was his financial strategy. He just was able to commit to it. He was one of these exceptional people who was able to systematize his life without automation, because at the time he was growing up, automation wasn't a thing. So he managed to do that with his life. And again, not to overlook the fact that cost of living strategies were very different at the time of his growing up. The most important part is that the commitment to a plan is the most important part. We live in an age where impulse tends to override. This is because companies have set up systems, through our wonderful handy-dandy smartphones in order to try to maximize our purchase. There are literally algorithms, right, that operate in order to really get us to compulsively act. So if you're able to overcome this, or you're able to not fall victim to everything around you that's trying to get you to act impulsively, you could be the next Ronald Read. You could be someone who is very low-key but ends up very financially well off. Anyways, that's really the point of today's video. The takeaway is that you need to systematize, that you need to overcome the behavior that makes you not commit to the plan. Most plans work. Most plans work. It's all a question of behavior, not intelligence. And behavior is hard to teach. So just remove yourself from the equation as much as possible. Minimize how many choices you actively have to make, and you will end up in a great position. That's Patrick with your data-driven principles for the day. Have a good one. Till next time.